Good evening. As many of you know, I work in churchyards, digging graves, general maintenance, and so I have an interest in tombstones. Not only the tombstones in my own churchyard, most of which I know, but whenever I go away, I always, if possible, go and look into a local churchyard and see what information I can gather off tombstones. But the information on tombstones is often notoriously lacking. And this was very much the case of one I found to a Sandra Claybury. And it is said that pride goes very much before a fall, and that was possibly what happened in this particular case. Sandra's husband was a crime writer called Howard Claybury. He was a very successful writer, very, very popular one. But his crime stories always came about with a difference. He always had the bad guys coming out on top. They were pitted against the local police, who he referred to as the Shire Constabulary, and whenever he could, made sure that they were made fools of. But Sandra, his wife, had disappeared. He had reported her missing to the police, and as far as the local police were concerned, he was number one suspect for having done away with her. But they couldn't prove anything. He was arrested twice, interviewed twice, and in the end had to be released for lack of proper evidence. On this particular night, it is Howard Claybury's first public appearance since being released from police custody. Alexander Curzon, who is the manager of the local town hall, knows he's onto a good thing. People come from miles, absolutely miles around, to hear Howard Claybury talk. In Alexander's view, Claybury is a very smug, egotistical individual who, frankly, he doesn't like. But as against that, he's more than happy to enjoy the proceeds that come from any event that Howard Claybury has been speaking at. And for this point, Alexander Curzon, the manager, has got extra bar staff on. He's hoping to make quite a killing that night. And he wants a night that is going to be remembered. When everybody is settled down and there are one or two people allowed to stand, he went to the back of the stage and said to Howard, "It's a good audience tonight, Howard." "Oh yes," said Howard very smugly. "They'll come absolutely miles to see me." So he made a bit of a song and dance about smoothing down his hair and his tie-less suit and shirt and trotted out onto the stage. There was a tremendous applause and people were whistling and cheering, and Howard absolutely loved it. It was a dab hand at playing to the audience with an absolute vengeance. "Good evening," he said. "I would like tonight to have called my talk, 'How to Get Away with Murder.'" Great guffaws of laughter. He said, but the local plod here, who frankly couldn't find a bar of chocolate in a sweet shop, would be most offended. More cheering, loud applause, etc. And Howard went through his repertoire of all the stories he had known, many of them his various anecdotes, and the audience loved it. At the end, after about an hour, the manager called a halt, thinking of his bar profits that were going to start, and drew the talk to an end. "Good evening," he said. "It's me again. Now, Howard has offered to answer one or two questions. So if there is anybody with a question, if you'd like to speak now, Howard will probably answer it." "Yes," came a female voice from the back of the stalls. "I have a question." "Oh, go ahead, my dear," said Howard in his most patronising tone. "Yes," said the female, and people turned to look at her, but they couldn't really make her out. "Yes," she said, "I'd like to know how you murdered your wife." There's a sudden, shocked silence. Alexander coughed and spluttered and said, "I really don't think that's a proper question." "Doesn't matter," said Howard, "I'm more than happy to answer it. As I keep telling the plod, my dear," he said, "I didn't murder Sandra." "Oh yes, you did," said this woman. And by now, there's quite a bit of hush in the audience. People are still trying to see who this woman is who's posing these questions. But they can't make her out. She seems to be stood in shadow. And the more Howard looks at her, he's beginning to get just a little bit uneasy. She has one or two mannerisms, like sweeping her hair back and tossing her head, that reminds him so much of Sandra. In the wings, out of sight, the detective inspector and the detective sergeant are waiting. "Good girl, Helen," said the detective inspector, and he went on to explain that they had a plant in the audience. One of their detectives, Helen Baxter, who was done a lot of amateur dramatics, and she was going to ask Howard these awkward questions. But the questioner still kept going on. "Well, why? Why? Where did you hide my body?" My body. People noticed this suddenly. This was a little bit different. This wasn't what they had expected. And Howard is beginning to lose his cool. He's beginning to lick his lips. He's beginning to sweat, and he's getting all fidgety and bothered. "Yes," said the figure, "where did you hide my body?" "It was in the woods, wasn't it?" "Oh no," said the detective inspector, "it wasn't in the woods. We know full well it was up on the moors." "Look, boss," said the detective sergeant, and they looked back again, and Howard is even more upset, even more, now licking his lips, and is really quite upset. "Come on," said the figure, tell me, where is my body?" And finally Howard said, He's stuttering away, and you can imagine the audience is absolutely expectant. What's he going to come out with? But then he gathered himself again and said, stuttering away, "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh yes you do," said the figure. "What happened? We had an argument, didn't we? You didn't like the criticism I had made of one of your characters. And I stormed away, didn't I?" "Yes," said Howard, looking down at the floor. "That's what I told the police. And I don't know what happened to you after that." "Oh yes you do," she said. "I went with the dog, you followed, and you strangled me with the dog lead, didn't you?" "Oh God," said Howard on his knees, "I'm ever so sorry, Sandra. I'm ever so sorry. And I killed the dog as well." By now, the atmosphere in the town hall is absolutely electric. Alexander Curzon had wanted a night to be remembered, but he hadn't expected it to develop this way. As far as they were concerned, that was all the confession the police needed. And so they walked on stage and told Howard that they had heard his confession. So had all these other people, and Howard was very contrite. "I was very clever, gentlemen," he said. "I must give you credit for that. Putting one of your officers in the audience to impersonate my Sandra. That was clever. Even I couldn't have thought of that one," he said. "But I had you fooled, didn't I? Because I told you we were up on the moors, when in fact we'd been in the woods. But nevertheless," he said, "you've got it right." So he was arrested and cautioned, and 2 uniformed police officers arrived, and then they removed him from the stage. Alexander Curzon has now got to close the town hall. It wasn't the way the night ended that he wanted to. He was expecting to make an awful lot of money on the bar, but it just didn't happen. And as the last of the audience began to file away, the detective sergeant said, "I wonder where Helen is. She should be with us by now." And they looked over to where Helen should have been sat in the audience, but everywhere now in the town hall is empty. In the distance, coming through the walls of the town hall, they can hear some emergency vehicle 2-tones coming. And as they made their way out to the front of the town hall, they can see flashing blue lights, and a police car drove up and stopped right outside the town hall. The passenger door opened, and Helen Baxter climbed out, ran across to the inspector, said, "I'm ever so sorry, boss, I'm ever so sorry, My car broke down up on the moors, and you know there's no radio signal up there. But you've just done a good job in there. Inspector said, I didn't. I've been trying to get here ever for the past hour. That's right, sir, said the police driver who had just joined them. I had to go up and collect her. Her car had broken down. But, said the detective sergeant, if that wasn't you in the audience asking questions of Howard Claybury, who was it? That's the story, folks. If it's true or not, that's up to you to decide. As many of you know, I work in a churchyard, sometimes on general maintenance, sometimes digging graves, and I have an interest in tombstones. But I've discovered over the years, what you read on a tombstone is not necessarily the true story involving that person. There's also a bit of advice that people are given. It's called, let the buyer beware. But in the case of Ricky Walter, who we're going to tell you about in just a moment, perhaps his advice should have been, let the thief beware. It all began at a Warwickshire auction room, and the auction rooms had been in the same family since the 1880s, but over the years the quality of stuff they had been selling had deteriorated. Now it was mainly stuff that wasn't wanted at jumble sales, or a whole lot of reproduction items that had been made in the Far East and were bought by the dozen from wholesalers. And so the auctioneer began his tired performance. Really, he was getting past his own sell-by date and should have gone out to pastures new quite some time ago. There was him, just the auctioneer, and old Fred, the porter. It was a fairly desultory morning until the auctioneer came to lot number 351. Here, ladies and gentlemen, he said, we have a most unusual lot. It's 351 in your catalogues, and you'll see it is a life-size brass king cobra snake. Ooh, he said to try and get a bit of enthusiasm going from his audience, but he was struggling hard. This item, he continued, he said, is a religious ornament. And whoever buys it, as long as you treat it with respect, you will come to no harm. But if you treat it with disrespect, then who knows what might happen to you. At that moment, Fred the porter tapped the snake with the car radio aerial that he used as a pointer, immediately clutched at his throat and began to gasp. Oh! The audience was suddenly very interested. Okay, Fred, said the auctioneer, that will do. And Fred came back to life again with a large grin. It was all part of the act and the comedy, which was one of the reasons that people still came to this particular show auction room. Right, ladies and gentlemen, what am I bid for this wonderful item? Who'll start me at £300? 250? Ultimately, a voice came from the back of the room saying, £5. It dragged up and dragged up till he reached £35. It's going for the first time, going for the second, £75, came a voice from the back, who everybody recognised was Harold Johnson, a local antique dealer. And whatever Harold wanted, Harold got. So they knew there was no point bidding against him. And at the end of the auction, then Harold collected the bits and pieces he had purchased, including lot 351, put them into his car and drove off back home. He lived in a rundown area that's just on the edge of the city, and although his family tried to get him to leave, he wouldn't do so. But he insisted he'd been born in that house, he'd raised his family in that house, and he would die in that house. It was fitted with the latest alarms, but there was a problem. There was a bit of a delay when he arrived at the front gate. It was an electronic gate, and he had to wait while it was being opened. And when he arrived after this particular auction sale, waiting for the gate to open, that's when Ricky Walter struck. Before Harold knew what had happened, His driving side window had been smashed and he had a knife thrust into his face. "Get out the car!" snarled Ricky. Whilst Harold struggled to get his seatbelt undone, Ricky reached in and pulled him out, pushed him into the pavement, and then got in the car and drove off. Ricky drove fairly sensibly, didn't want to draw any attention to himself, and linked up with the van he had parked on the outskirts of town, where he was transferred all the stolen items he had got that day, including the stuff he had taken from Harold. When he got back to his apartment, as he liked to call it, which was really the ground floor in an old, run-down country house, he looked at what he had stolen that day. He wasn't particularly interested in the bits of china that Harold had, but he was interested in the snake. He thought that the snake there, with his glittering red eyes and his jaw open and fangs exposed, really summed up Ricky. He thought, just like me. He looked around and around, couldn't find where to actually put the snake. Finally, he put it on the sideboard. It was alongside an ashtray that was absolutely full of nub ends and ash, and that gave Ricky an idea. He lit himself a cigarette, and when he had had a couple of puffs at it, he put the cigarette into the snake's jaws. As he did so, he wasn't sure if it was his imagination or not, but it did look as if the snake's red eyes had glittered somewhat. He thought it was just a trick of the light, thought no more of it, and the next day went out again on another one of his thieving sprees. When he came back that evening, he realized that something was missing. It took him a while to work out what it was. And he realized it was the snake, the brass snake, had gone. And he thought, some thieving individual's been in my property and stolen this snake. Then he laughed at the irony. How could he, a well-known thief, go to the police complaining that he had been burgled and robbed and seriously expect the police to do anything about it? He saw the funny side of it and opened his bottle of whiskey, was having a few drinks, when he was aware of a slight rustling sound behind him. "Who's there?" he said. It was a few days later when two police constables attended at the apartment where Ricky lived. They'd been asked to attend by one of the neighbours, who said they hadn't seen Ricky for a few days, and they were a little bit concerned about the smell that was coming from the apartment. They weren't too worried about not having seen him, because they didn't pay any attention to what he did, and he didn't pay any attention to what they did. The two police officers recognized the smell and decided they would have to go into the apartment and investigate its source. It was easier said than done. They didn't have any keys. They had to force the door open, and were surprised to see how reinforced it was on the inside, with angle iron and bars across. The moment they got in the apartment, they stopped. Could not believe the amount of goods that had obviously been stolen that there were stashed all around the place. Then they saw Ricky's body lying by the table and decided it wasn't a job for them, it was a job for the detectives. So they had to summon a police surgeon to come along and look at Ricky's body, because there's no way an ambulance would have taken him, and waited for the arrival of the detective inspector. When the inspector arrived, he was quite amazed at the amount of stolen property that was in there. He knew from all the various circulation lists that these were stolen antiques, white goods. The place was absolutely bulging with it. But he was a bit concerned about what had happened to Ricky Walker. Although Ricky was a well-known thief, the mere fact that he was a thief didn't mean that his death should not be investigated. "Well, Doc," he said, "what can you tell me?" "Well," said the doctor, he said, "I can tell you this, the man is definitely dead, but you know that." "I appreciate all that," said the inspector, again thinking of his budgetary constraints. But can you answer me a question? Has he died or has he been killed? The doctor said, well, he has been killed. This was what the detective inspector did not want to hear. Can you give me the cause of death? He said to the doctor. Oh yes, said the doctor, I can do that. Look, and he pointed to 2 puncture marks on Ricky's throat. He says, that undoubtedly caused his death. And what caused it? Said the inspector. It's something, said the doctor, I had never expected to see in England. Back home in my native India, yes. That, he says, is the bite of the Ophiophagus hana, better known as the king cobra, just like that brass one you have on the sideboard there, sitting alongside the ashtray. That's the story I was told. Whether it's true or not, I leave you to make your own mind up on that. Good evening.